We are live and recording. This is going to be a typing session using Socionics Model A. The definitions and terminology used will be reflective of that. At the end will be a DCNH subtype that is Model G, and that is correlated with neurotransmitters.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
It is interesting. We have sorry. I'm going to be asking a series of open-ended questions. I mean, a series of questions. I would like for you to treat them as if they're open-ended and feel free to just elaborate and to talk at will. This is your time to talk and my
All
time to
right.
listen. Also, this is not me telling you your type. This is me giving you my suggestion on what I think you are. So use this as just another data point in crafting your own identity, for only you know yourself to the highest degree. Are you ready?
Yep.
How do you handle the emotions of others?
Primarily, I seek to first understand why they feel that way. And also, if their emotions represent any kind of immediate danger, I'll usually try to react to that in a way that I can bring it to a controllable level. And then I'll kind of dig into why they feel that way so that I can best figure out how to fix the problem that those emotions represent. I typically am angling every interaction I have with somebody in such a way that I set them up on an optimal path forward because of my fundamental beliefs that everything plays an important role in the world, and the more functioning parts you can create, the better the overall quality will be. In terms of when somebody's coming at me really hot and I'm not prepared though, and I start getting defensive, can be when I kind of like flip a switch and will almost go like disciplinarian on them and just completely call them out for inappropriate behavior. But that's really only that's rare, and if I'm caught off guard.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to say?
Typically, I don't tend to like dealing with other people's emotions when I am erratic myself, just because of how much attention I put into those things. It just takes a lot of energy. But other than that, I feel I've answered that in a complete enough way that I don't feel like I'm leaving anything out.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. Can you tell me about any reoccurring problems you've been having in your life?
Mm-hmm. So I continually struggle with I think the biggest thing is I continually struggle with finding a consistent not a consistent meaning, but a consistent meaning in relationships with things and with people, just because of how much energy it takes to maintain. So I guess that's actually really what the main thing is. It's just consistently having energy and being naturally motivated. Excuse me. Being naturally motivated towards things. My environment is rarely conducive to how I naturally am. So a lot of how I behave comes from conscious effort and that gets very exhausting, and it's something that kind of leads me to be very like detached from a lot of what I'm doing. There's a lot of like wisdom and knowledge in what I do, but not a lot of me. And kind of balancing the loneliness that inevitably comes after I fall out of doing the, more didactic things that I do with my day, and I'm just there by myself and I have to just be myself, that's when the loneliness can really hit pretty hard. Um, I would say deadlines too, like knowing something is coming up in the future and thinking about the steps I have to take to complete that often takes a lot of the focus away from the present moment, because if I do focus on the present moment, I get so involved with what I'm doing then that I usually can't, you know, arrive on time for that deadline, or I don't accurately perceive all of the things that I have left to do for it. So it can kind of cause me to be a lot less engaged in the things I'm doing in the present moment when I have a definitive deadline coming up later in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And another reoccurring problem that I have is definitely it kind of comes down to trusting people. And it's not that I don't give them chances, it's just that they often don't prove capable of, you know, more be they don't prove capable of being more involved with me, because either A, they show no interest in actually being deeper, and those that do usually don't stick around long enough anyway for me to want to invest the effort. Um, yeah,
Okay.
I say those are the primary recurring problems.
Quite an extensive list.
Yes, there's a lot of recurring problems.
Well, that's good because you're paying attention. All right. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question.
Mhm.
What are your hopes, dreams, and aspirations?
Mm. All right, let me think about this for a second. My hopes are that eventually everyone will understand enough about the human condition to be able to extend empathy to one another, and that they will eventually understand enough about wisdom and truth to know when to use discipline and when to use, you know, brotherly love kind of thing. Really, my hope is that people wake up to the reality that they are often the ones creating the hell that they live in, and that they would eventually take accountability for the ways that they've screwed up. And my hope for myself, and what I guess would be my aspiration, is to do everything that I can to create an environment in which that can happen, because there's so many factors that are inextricably linked to each other and causally inextricably linked. To the point where you have to have accounted for the myriad of different ways in which somebody's social status would be affected by taking accountability for something like that, as well as the psychological resistance to the perceived loss of social status, and trying to manufacture and can really just for now conceptualize a way in which we as a society can conceivably transition into a an era, if you will, of psychology being the primary form of enlightenment, a psychological renaissance, if you will, is almost what I'm after. Um, and my aspirations have always kind of been angled around that. I think if you want to get more nuanced and practical as far as what my aspirations are, it's to get my life in order enough so that I feel that I can pursue that vision and not be, you know, hindered in any unnecessary ways. And
Okay.
other than hopes and aspirations, I don't really have any others other than that that are even worth mentioning.
Okay. All right. We'll go ahead and move on then. You are elected the dictator of your home country for 6 months to solve its problems. What do you do?
Well, pretty much exactly what I just said with the aspirations, but I'll elaborate a little more. Um, I think the primary thing that I would do, and this is going to seem incredibly drastic, but other than the essential workers, like hospital staff and, grocery stores and things like that, I'd shut down the entire country. Like, just completely shut it down, give everybody I want to say a 3 to 4 week vacation. And I would get as many social and clinical workers together as I could and kind of divide them up into a task force where they go and kind of monitor the environments. Like they're given a neighborhood, for example, or something to watch over those 3 or 4 weeks, and to make sure that the people are transitioning off of the consumer culture that has been so rampantly created and has caused people an absolute inability to find their own internal states of motivation. Um, to be fair, the final plan for this would be phenomenally more nuanced. I haven't exactly written out an entire battle strategy, but I probably should at some point. Um, but after that 3 to 4 week period, I would allow people to come back in stages based off of them passing certain cognitive assessments of competence, if you will. And to be fair, that would be something that would have to be handled on a case by case basis. Um, Beyond that, once everyone's been properly integrated back into society, it becomes much more a matter of regulating the potential relapses that can happen, and I would strictly limit the use of the internet um, in people under the ages of 18. I would significantly increase the public I would try to significantly increase the public motivation to engage in communal events, trying to bring back a sense of unity in a community, in your neighborhood, rather than us all belonging to one global common area, which is social media. Um, I think as a next step to that as well, to ensure that the future generation kind of comes up along the same lines, I would really put a huge emphasis on schools being primarily targeted towards developing independent and critically thinking children and those that are built for that, and then still having the outlets for those who are more attuned to be like the desk workers and the hard data crunchers. I would really, I would have a team of psychologists that would be assigned ideally to every school on like a roaming um, path where they go and assess the students on, you know, their personality types and what they're best fit for, like how they're naturally wired, and to champion the kids and get put them in an environment where they are meant to excel. Because it's a part of my fundamental beliefs again that everybody is kind of made with a specific purpose. Um, Insofar as that they have something that they themselves can do better than anyone else. And I think a lot of what Jung has done and a lot of what socionics is getting at is very useful in determining those kinds of things. So, if I was president for 6 months, the first month I would do that hard reset for everybody. Number one, because I know so many people are just swamped completely and never feel like they can take a break. Um, And then after that, once everybody is kind of like detoxed pretty much, and we've kind of integrated everyone else back in further down the line for those that weren't able to recover in that amount of time, um, I would implement the ideas of, you know, communally assigned tasks, and I'd work on creating more jobs based off of the same thing I was talking about with the school stuff. Um, and I think that's probably what I would go for in my 6 months if I was elected dictator of my country. Because I think at that point you've set things up enough to where it would regulate itself for the most part.
Okay. Very interesting stuff. We are moving slowly, but we are moving thoroughly. We'll move on to the next. Would you consider yourself logically consistent?
Extremely, yes.
How
Do I
so?
think other people consider me that? Absolutely not. I consider myself logically consistent because I weigh things up in terms of how they serve one ultimate goal. So even though certain things may seem contradictory, when you view them as two individual items balancing on a greater scale to create a certain distribution, then it makes perfect sense. Like when you realize the intent of something outweighing another, you realize that what seemed to be logical inconsistency because individually two items had different weights really made sense in the greater scheme of things because you found out that conceptually object B, which is lighter, actually carries just as much significance in a smaller volume as item A, which may have more mass and may be heavier, but it just doesn't serve as much of a function per weight, per unit of weight. It's not the greatest way of explaining it, but I think you kind of get what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Do you tend to categorize the external world?
Do I what?
Do you tend to categorize the external world?
I would say to an extent I do. And the extent to which I categorize it is that I will look at something and I'll be like, okay, this fits this criteria, and therefore it can be labeled as this, but it really is kind of just a functional thing. I believe categories, I believe states of being and anything that I attempt to categorize is inevitably fluent, not fluent, fluid. Um, I do categorize, but I don't hard categorize. It's kind of a constantly categorizing thing. Things are constantly shifting and changing what I conceptualize them as.
Okay.
I guess the only real consistent categorization I have is true and untrue. That would be the only hard categories that I divide things into.
Okay. Would you say that you're open to new ideas?
Yeah, I'm definitely open to new ideas. I can tell you that there's probably not going to be too many that come my way at this point that are capable of shifting the way that I see things, um, from a fundamental standpoint. But yeah, there's new things that come along all the time that kind of add to my total understanding. So in that sense, I'm definitely open to new ideas.
Okay. Do you like to travel?
I don't mind it. Um, always do enjoy being able to take in new information from places, but I don't feel like it serves my goals right now, just because of how much I'm trying to get things on track and stable. I think if I had a partner, then it would be one thing, but having a stable home or at least one consistent thing in my life is so important to me that right now, unless, like I said, I had a partner that was there with me, I wouldn't want to travel. Just because I need that consistency that I can come back to.
Okay. Do you take an interest in history?
Not particularly. I used to be interested in it. I think it's kind of bullshit at this point because so many people did so many wrong things in the past anyway, and we're still where we are now, and nobody else fucking figured shit out on how to make it better. So fuck them. I'm gonna do it my way. I don't need to read about how other people came to the same conclusions I'm already gonna get to myself.
Okay. All right. How do you handle conflict with others?
Usually brilliantly. Again, though, it depends on how composed I am. If I'm composed, then it doesn't bother me at all, and I can usually diffuse and disarm the conflict almost immediately because I can understand where the other person is coming from. But there's sometimes that, like, when it's later at night and I'm tired or I just really am stressed out, I really can blow up. Like, I can go on a moral rant about how this person is this and that and that and this. Um, and really, it pains me when people are inconsistent with their conflict, and it's like, if I can tell that it's something petty, I will call it out for what it is. My response usually tends to be, um, I can't think of the word for it, but it tends to be equivalent to the degree of morality that they assign it to. Um, and also equivalent to the degree of the stupidity of the reasons that that said person is angry.
Okay.
I can be pretty conflict averse, but again, that really just kind of comes from how well I'm feeling. Like, if I feel sick or low energy, I don't want to fucking deal with it. Like, that's the last thing I want to deal with when I feel that way.
Okay. Give me just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hesitate or exercise caution?
I would say big time, yeah. I definitely always try to fully understand something before I jump into it. If I
Okay.
perceive any kind of risk to something, I usually won't take it because it means I haven't properly assessed all of the potential outcomes of something. But that's also kind of come about because I don't want to put myself in a position where I get screwed over again and waste more of my life and my energy because I've done that too much already.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Um,
It's all good.
how do you form your moral values?
I form them based off of what would be best for me and the people I love. And it really is actually that simple. But in terms of what would be the best, that's where it can get complicated. But I pretty much just determine that by a lot of careful observation and consideration as to the cause and effect of every single action that people take part in and every source of input that they receive from the outside world. And I've always been seeking to create a structure in which I can regulate the kind of input that people receive only so that I could filter out the undesired input or at least know what is going into them so that I can give the proper input to counter that. It kind of comes down to my quote that I made about wisdom. I came up with my own definition for it. Um, that wisdom is the understanding of cause and effect across time, circumstance, and social. Time, circumstance. No, it's time, society, and self. Um, I can't remember the word, but it's like it starts with a C and it just means at one time. Um, like considering all of those things at the same time and finding that proper conceptual balance I explained earlier with the different weighted things on the scales, creating one equally weighted reality as an entire object. Yin is not at all balanced like without yang, but together they balance each other out to create an equal whole.
Okay.
Like there's more water on the planet than there is land, but that doesn't make Earth dysfunctional. And that's the same thing that I'm explaining, that things can be out of balance, but still create a greater truth that either is balanced or is just how things are.
Mm-hmm. How do you understand your own emotions?
It's twofold. I understand them as a response to the environment around me, as well as my internal states. Um, and I also understand them as a means to communicate the inner spiritual state that I am experiencing. Um, I feel that they're one of the fundamental ways that we interpret and experience consciousness in a meaningful way. Um, and I really think that emotions are actually spiritual tools that are meant to guide us towards the truth. And I understand my emotions very much the same way. I believe they're meant to signify when spiritually things are out of balance, and the regulating of those emotions and or the releasing of those energies helps restore the equilibrium. And the equilibrium is the concept of peace for me. Emotions are tools to guide you back towards peace and serenity.
And there is also a negative to that positive as well, where the emotions are also unbalancing.
Uh, I mean, I would say that's still part and parcel with my explanation. I never indicated that all of the emotions were particularly, they serve the function of indicating you have to seek towards stability. Um, but the thing with emotions is once you actually let them out, they never actually continue to cause problems unless you're given feedback from your external environment that exacerbates the situation. So I'm talking about, like, conceptually, we're isolating emotional expression from any other kind of feedback. This is just simply a releasing of the energy. Nothing else is interacting with that energy. That will always be a stabilizing interaction for the individual releasing the emotions.
All right. At this point, we are 60% done with the typing.
Okay.
Would you consider yourself good at predicting the future?
Extraordinarily, yes. Something I wish more people understood about me.
What about it do you think you're good at predicting?
The way in which problems will arise in the future and how people will respond to it based off of their complexes and behavior patterns. I think it's the idea that history repeats itself because human beings are too ignorant to see that you can't just keep plugging up water holes because eventually new ones are going to spring.
Okay. How do you manage time?
Inefficiently at best, but I view time as something that only matters insofar as that there's a limited amount of it. Um, and I think people being emphatic about timeliness are really just ignorant to the greater things that I'm trying to accomplish and aren't properly weighing up the consequences of holding me to temporal, standards,
Mm-hmm.
placing upon me temporal expectations. Um, I would say that time really has no meaning to me. Like, it really has no meaning to me whatsoever. It really is just a concept that, like, the perception of time genuinely does not matter to me because I don't divide up what I do on the basis of I want to spend this long doing this. It's always like, did I achieve what I wanted to achieve out of this? I don't care how long it took. I always want to try and achieve something the fastest way I can, sure, but as far as like handling time, that's never a fucking concern with anything that I do. Um, it only serves as, like I said, a tool for measuring effectiveness, I suppose. Um, as well as just a social communication of when something will occur in the future or when something occurred in the past. I know that didn't exactly answer the question you asked, but that was kind of a fascinating one I hadn't thought about before. Like,
Would
what
you
do I
mind?
actually think about the concept of time?
Okay. Very interesting. Would you mind backtracking just a little bit? Because like I had an idea as soon as you were talking about that, and I wrote it down. I know that you were
Mm,
talking about like ignoring states of time and all of this. Because it's like the thing that matters is like the philosophical axiom of it ending.
right.
So, but you said you had that interesting idea. I kind of wanted to hear that as well.
Okay. Well, with regards to that, like I said, time is simply a measurement as to the effectiveness of an individual in completing a certain task. That's the only real use I see from it in that regard. Um, and yeah, really what matters is that the objective is completed. The amount of time that it takes is completely irrelevant other than the reason I mentioned before. And I mean, if you really think about it, time as a concept only exists as an explanatory tool. Um, Other than that, you have biological degradation, which I guess would be a more accurate concept of what time really, the kind of time we really should be concerned about. Um, but in terms of like human deadlines, it's all bullshit. Um, but for things like sleep cycles or, birth, like the time it takes for a child to gestate in the womb, um, to even the amount of time of the average human lifespan, it's relevant for that kind of stuff, but no one should ever live their life by time because it takes away from the philosophical reality of whatever you're engaging with. I mean, think about it. If you're reducing something or any kind of experience and you're cutting it short because of time, that's such bullshit. You should absolutely never rob yourself of the conclusion of any kind of interaction on the basis of saving time. Saving energy, sure. Moving on to something that's more important, sure. But if you're just doing it on principle because you want to stay organized and on a schedule, man, fuck you. It's my little jab at ISTJs.
Which I don't know. I find that ISTJs or SLIs are not really conscientious enough to do that
Yeah, fair enough.
because they're irrational. They're not very loose ended. I find that SI in either the creative or the mobilizing position tends to result in somebody who behaves very much by structures and schedules. So that's basically like um, ESTJ or
ESTJs,
INFP,
yeah.
like that sort of thing. Because I find that ISTJs are like I can track everything, so I don't need to have my hands on it constantly.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. They're also very like dynamic people. You know what I mean? They're people who are going to be very focused on getting things done and accomplished. So they're not very
Yeah, my
specialist.
brother's an ISTJ.
Yeah, they're very generalist. And that's one of the things that I found out about them.
I'd say that's actually pretty true. He judges the shit out of me though, and it's been pissing me off lately.
Well, because you guys are duals. I think
I
duals.
know.
Something in socionics theory that I don't think is talked about enough is one. I mean, the duals are actually have a lot of overlap in a lot of ways, and they can look pretty similar. And then two, also one of the things that I find about them is that they also fight too because of their differences, and so it's not just like this magical harmony between these two people that really love each other, like
Oh
how
no,
they
we
kind of read them.
clash, and we like only clash.
Yeah, yeah, that there's also the big capability of them clashing, and that's what I see a lot with the ghouls. I got fired from my job for fighting with my duel. Interesting enough.
Mm.
So, yeah, but so and this has all been very interesting, but I just kind of fed you results, which I usually avoid doing. But fuck it, man, we're close to the end here.
I don't know what an SLI duel, what that the duel for the type of an ISTJ would be anyway, but um, so you didn't leak anything.
Cool. Excellent. Fantastic. Let's get back to it.
Alrighty, what's the next question?
How do you handle criticism?
Depends on how much I can perceive that person's knowledge on the subject that they're criticizing me on. If I can tell they don't know enough about my situation to offer genuine criticism, I usually react with disgust.
Okay.
Um, and typically, I will tend to question why they think that I have those particular problems or really what they're seeing. And if I conclude that they don't actually know what they're talking about, I quite plainly state that, at least now. I'll just plainly say to them that they don't really know what they're talking about, and that if they want to be able to offer genuine criticism, they need to take this, and this factor into account. But if I do perceive that the person knows more than me, um, I can be a little hurt sometimes, depending on the topic area involved, if it's something I'm passionate about.
Whoa, you just
Um,
roboted hardcore. It was really crazy.
am I still roboting?
No, but it sounded like that there
Okay.
was like that you were just assimilated by the Borg and you were being sent to kill me.
No, live long and prosper, my friend. I come in peace. Um, but in terms of areas in which I'm very passionate about, if I'm in an environment where I'm regarded as the authority on that, I can feel a little challenged when somebody else that's equally as competent shows up. But usually that fades pretty quickly, and I'm more interested in growing the group as a whole or growing my own understanding. And I usually end up stepping up to the plate saying, like, all right, you're sitting on top of a higher pedestal than I am, but I'm going to climb over you. Tell me what you know, and I'll do it better. Um, that's how I handle criticism.
Okay. Do you tend to focus on the outcome when making decisions?
Mm, That answer is so emphatically yes that I'm almost surprised it even was a question.
Okay. It, it's
I
just
can't conceptualize how anyone else would make decisions.
well, that's excellent. Because that really works. You really don't need to go into any more. Like I can honestly deconstruct a lot from just you saying that.
Yeah. I mean, I understand the idea that people could consider like the steps that have to go into it, and it's not like I'm ignorant to that, but if you consider you always have to weigh the outcome up at the end of the day because that is the reality that is created from that decision. All the rest is just ancillary bullshit. Like, if the outcome doesn't make sense, you can't ever justify any of the steps. Like, you have to have an end to justify the means.
Yes.
So that's why I just, it doesn't make any sense to me that you could make a decision not based off of the outcome and it be a truthful decision, an accurate one. I will make that distinction, but yeah.
Okay. We're gonna move on. Do you ever make decisions on the basis of the affect of others? Examples of this can include facial expression, tone of voice, or body language.
Oh, abso-freaking-lutely. And usually that's in specific contexts, though. Like if I'm trying to get a person to open up to me because I'm curious about particular bits of information, yes, I'm aware that's not exactly the most ethically sounding activity, but my curiosity knows no bounds. If I'm trying to get information out of somebody, I absolutely will play the part that I need to play. Um, to get the information that I need if they won't give it to me directly. And in that sense, I can pay a hell of a lot of attention to facial cues and body language and things like that. And even as a tennis coach, I pay a lot of close and intimate attention to people's like posture and even their attitude after points. I pay attention to the tonality in people's speech. I pay attention to all that shit because I'm always mining for information.
Ah, that's
God, I love
hilarious.
it.
You were
I
just like
love mining
demonstrating.
for the information.
You were just slapping me in the face with both of your four-dimensional functions simultaneously there. That's fun. Four-dimensional means strong, high resolution, by the way.
Hmm.
All right. Do you ever intentionally affect the emotions of others?
Regrettably. Um, yeah, and again, it usually is just when I've done it a few times out of pettiness, but usually that's just the small thing that I'll do. If I feel like I really have been slighted by that person, I'll kind of do it to give them a taste of their own medicine. Um, but then there are other times where if I'm getting really frustrated with someone not opening up, I will use some like narcissistic and or manipulative tactics to get them to at least crack a little bit, but that's only in really extreme circumstances.
All right.
And I mean like really extreme circumstances. It's something I probably haven't even done like more than 10 times. I want to say 10 to 20 because I did it a good bit when I was younger, just because I didn't have the same kind of. I wasn't punching in the same intellectual weight class, if you will.
Gotcha. Now moving
God,
on.
these conversations make me realize how much I'm wasting my brain, though, not actually stepping in and making changes in the environments that I'm in. But people are resistant to new ideas, so no. Heaven forbid we change the broken ways we do things. Anyway,
Okay. We're going to move on to the last round of questions.
alrighty.
Is it easy for you to relax?
Dude, no. Not even fucking close. Um, my brain never turns off. I'm always concerned with functioning optimally. And it's a pain in my motherfucking ass. Sorry to anyone who ever listens to this recording. Um, but I have, I'm pretty sure I haven't actually gotten it diagnosed, but I have a condition called hyperthyroidism, which even if I were to like meditate and de-stress and things like that, hyperthyroidism causes a continual release of like a continual activation of the adrenal glands, and that allows my body to very rarely actually enter a state of relaxation. And when you add the ADHD on top of that, the one thing I have been diagnosed with is GAD, or general anxiety disorder, on top of the ADHD.
High five, brother.
And the specific um,
Me too.
subtype of GAD that I have is like it's moderate to severe anxiety, I think is what we have it classified as now. Um, borderline mad, major anxiety disorder. Because I genuinely, the last couple of nights, it's been better because I've really been making an effort to fix things for myself and feel like I have a little more control and direction. But for the last several months, I've literally been going to sleep shaking at night. Like, my body is so worried about down regulating that it will continually like jerk me back awake every time I start to try and relax deeper.
Okay.
Like the only time I ever can relax is when I'm so fucking exhausted that my body is like, okay, we can't make any more adrenaline, haha. But that's also why I've gotten so much done and done so much critical thinking, is because my brain is always turned way up to 11.
Okay. That's actually really corresponding to some things that I've heard a long time ago about this, about the angle I'm looking at. So that's fun.
Well, that's cool. I'm excited to hear about that.
Yeah, bro. Uh, your textbook. Not textbook, I would say. It was easy.
Okay. So, what I gotta say though is if I'm textbook, am I at least rare? Because I don't want too many me's to be out there in the world.
You are actually the most common subtype of the sociotype I'm gonna give you that I've
What
typed so
the fuck?
far. I don't know if it's like the most common out in the world, but drawn to intellectual and philosophical shit, yes, this subtype is all over the place with that. And I can give you a great example of someone who goes around talking continuously about the exact same things that you do, not in the same domain. No, in the same domain, but not precisely the exact same thing. Um,
All right, well, I'm gonna give myself some copium and say I'm doing it better than him, so.
her. It's a girl.
Oh,
She's from Canada.
how old is
But
she?
probably a few years older than you. Probably mid 20s. Probably like 24 or something.
That don't bother me too much. I would like to meet this person. I am intrigued.
You know her. Guaranteed.
I do. What is
Yeah.
her name?
Not during the recording because I don't know.
Ah,
Would you be
okay,
cool with me
okay.
posting this as part of a podcast?
Yeah, no, go for it.
Cool, bro. You'll be one of my first. I love posting any DOMs. I mean, I haven't done it yet, but like I always like really like listening to their typing sessions. So, and
Mm-hmm.
it turns out, well, I've already given you the result anyway. But so the funny part is that any DOMs, it's like the funny thing is it's like when you ask them, it's like, oh, do you want to be typed by some crazy man over the internet? And all of them say yes. And so the vast majority of my
Yes,
recordings are of any
absolutely.
DOMs.
Yeah. I've been thinking the whole time how much I've enjoyed just having these open-ended questions that I can take and just run with. So, like, this is the kind of stuff that I'm really, really good at, and I wish I could get paid for.
Yeah. The truly extroverted variants of your type actually don't like the open-ended questions. They're like, context, please. Context, please.
Oh, I'm sure. If you're primarily the extroverted manifestation of the type that I think I am, at least, like, if you don't have the context that your NE and TE can actually grab onto, um, it's funny watching someone like my sister who's so extrovertedly sensitive and like it's not sensitive but extrovertedly dominant as an ENTJ. Like if you don't give her all of the information for her TE and SE to process, she just will not fucking respond at all.
That's funny.
It's like I just sit there sometimes and I'm like, "Can you generate a conversation, please?" And she's just like, "No." Like, just tell me what you wanted to talk to me about. And I'm like, I want to have a human interaction, not an input output interaction.
Hmm.
But she is unbelievably helpful when it comes to needing somebody to externalize my ideas against for that exact reason. Someone like Mobius actually is another wonderful example of that. He's unbelievably good at working with what you give him and just like putting plainly how it sounds to him. And
Yes.
for me, that gives my NETE access enough feedback where it's like, okay, I mean, that's not exactly how I wanted it to come across, or that doesn't play out in someone else's mind exactly how I thought it would, so I can immediately change it. I remember I had a 4 hour long conversation with him one time where we were talking about all different kinds of business deals and ideas and things like that. Um, and by the end of it, for like the last hour, I was just kind of talking to him about all the things that I'd been going through because we both were trying to get our lives together more and more around the same time, and we'd kind of been keeping up with each other. And in just 1 hour of talking to him and going back and forth with somebody who understood the human body, psychology, and neuroscience, honestly, to a greater degree than I did. Um, but still not to the point where it felt like I was wasting his time. We I felt like I made more progress from a therapy standpoint with him in 1 hour than I ever would have in like a year of therapy.
Wow.
And it's just because it was so rapid fire with the externalization of my NETE being able to very plainly articulate what my SI experiences had cataloged over the years, or actually rather over the months that we hadn't spoken, and all of the FI morality that I had finally like cooked into a consistent shape. Um, it was just really easy for me to throw everything at him and have him hit it back, and just throwing those exchanges out back and forth and kind of going down the different like rabbit holes that each thing led. It was pretty much like you had a really complex anthill that if you were just an ant would take forever to navigate because you can only go down one hole at a time. What it felt like for him and I is we basically just explored it with, how you pour mercury down an anthill and then you brush it away and it comes out that really crazy shape. Not mercury, but like aluminum or something like that. We
Yeah.
pretty much did that with understanding ourselves in that hour.
That's great. That's fantastic. Um, I've got one more question to ask you though, and then we'll move on to the results portion. So
Okay.
we can have some free and open conversation here at the end of it, especially because like once my brain will stop having to focus so much because I was collecting a lot of information that entire time.
Yeah.
Okay, is your room clean?
No.
When you do clean it, how and why?
Usually when I am so stressed that I need a break, and I turn my stress kind of, really, it's an unhealthy way of releasing my stress that manifests as what other people see as healthy. It's kind of like if an ENFP were to go in their SI grip, um, in Jungian psychology, and just be like, okay, my sensory world around me is completely disorganized, and I need to feel like I'm fucking capable of managing something. So then I will clean my entire room, like top to bottom, perfect spick and span. Like it will shine. And then usually that just makes me feel like, it makes me feel better, but at the same time, I just feel cheap. I'm like, that's not really who I am. This room is gonna be a mess again in another 3 weeks.
Okay.
So I only really clean in manic episodes.
Well, it actually makes a lot of sense with the way that I describe it. Okay. Now, we can move on to the results portion.
Alrighty, Doc.
I'm going to
Let's
describe
hear it.
I'm going to describe like a few of the Raynian dichotomies, and then we're going to go into the quadra, and then afterwards we'll talk about the elements themselves or the functions, as some
Alright, this
call it.
is the hard part because now I have to listen.
Yes, yeah, yeah. This is the part where I talk. This is where we change roles. Whew. Okay. So we're going to start first with rational versus irrational. And so, um, rational types are going to lead or have the base of a judging function. So, wait a second. Can you give me just a moment? I'll be right back.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so as I was saying, the rational types, that they lead with a judging function. They tend to be
Mm-hmm.
rigid in the way that they make decisions, and will have that rigidity in their body language and communication. They will
Mm-hmm.
also tend to, when they make decisions, they will follow things through to the end, and they tend not to change their minds as often. Irrational types, on the other hand, lead with a perceiving function, and so they are going to be more open ended and more wait and see and more situational. They are also going to be
Mm-hmm.
more fluid in the way that they talk and behave and maneuver their bodies and such. So, I am under the impression that you are irrational, mostly because you're not sitting here and having rational type problems of basically it's like I am not at the same, like, you know what I mean? It's not that you're processing it from the point of like an individual or specific circumstances, but it's kind of generally this cascade of different phenomenon that you're kind of focusing on. It's like when you're getting into arguments with people, you're arguing over the things instead of the people. So it's like you're not sitting there and being aggressive towards people on the basis of if you like that person or not. For example, like an
Right.
ESI or FISE would be. It's like
Very rare that that happens.
I don't like this person, so I'm going to push you around. It's we disagree over the subject, and that's what I think.
Yeah.
It's that you're kind of focused more on the idea of things than you really are about having like too much structure that you can't really escape from. Um,
Right.
all right, so next we're going to move on to process result. And so, result types are going to be people, and this has nothing to do with TI versus TE, by the way. Result types are going to be people who are going to say, "Well, of course we had the right process because we got the correct result." They're going to be people who will skim through the chapter, who will kind of pull information from different places and sources, and then they will focus on the application and the outcome rather than actually
Mm.
than having a thorough understanding. The process types are more likely to read completely through all of the literature that is pertinent to what they're trying to accomplish. They're going to be very thorough, and they're going to be focused on being able to do the whole thing in a way that's very structured and faithful. And they'll say, "Well, of course we had the right result because we followed the right process." I myself am a process type. I don't know if you can tell. But I definitely believe that your result, um, mostly because it's like you can't really imagine a place where you're focusing too much on the process of doing it. I was like seeing that.
I can't imagine that as an end goal or as a primary motivator. Those
Yes,
seem
the
like,
motivation.
yeah, those seem like necessary tools to achieve the final outcome, but as far as like justifying the final outcome by trusting that you're going through the right process, you can't ever have determined what the right process was in the first place unless you had a prior outcome to weigh that up against.
Yes. I mean, you can see how it's kind of like talking about that. When you're talking about these things, when you're talking about like society or like the purpose of like reason and such, I'm maybe making generalizations here, but you are talking very much about like the output, right? And so it's like, what does all of this end up to? What does it all end up becoming? These sorts of things. You're not necessarily digging through like the whole process of what it is. You're focused on the whole structure as it kind of comes out and as it is, and then that's what you're kind of interested in. And so it's like
Right.
throughout the entire typing session, I was just hearing result, 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 result. Didn't matter what function I was looking at. Didn't matter what question I was asking you. You weren't going through the same way that it's like I focus primarily on the thoroughness, like an LSI or like an EII, so an INFP or an ISTP. You don't really have that type of behavior mentality. Um, so now we can move on to dynamic versus static. And so the interesting thing is in the type code in socionics, the four-letter type code, which I don't use. I think that's just going to confuse the hell out of everybody. But the type code uses rational versus irrational as a dichotomy that decides the fourth letter. Dynamic versus static is actually the MBTI equivalent of J versus P, if that makes sense, right? So,
That
um,
makes a lot of sense.
we're gonna start with
Dynamic likely being P, static being J.
we'll get into that. We'll get into that.
Okay, fair enough.
So dynamic types are going to be people who are going to be constantly updating their understanding of things. They will see things as sort of
Okay, so I
fluid.
wondered, didn't I?
Yeah, it's sort of fluid and flowing into each other. They are going to be people who are going to be very focused on going through all of going through information as it pertains to the project, not the other way around. So it's like
Mhm.
you learn on the basis of what you're trying to achieve. So that's not static, and that's not result versus process. But you can tell that it's like the person is considering things externally, right? That's where the
Mhm.
impetus comes from, the gathering of information. Static, on the other hand, and this is one of the things that I find is very difficult to communicate. But they say that the statics are people when their structure needs to be updated, the entire thing must change. It will the whole thing will be brought down and brought into a different state, and they will be perceiving things broadly and inspiring themselves on being able to come up with their own understandings of things. And the impetus for gathering the information is based off of their personal perspective rather than the external thing. Um,
Mhm.
I believe that you are static, and so this basically is talking about an introverted judging and extroverted perceiving. Because of kind of the way that you're talking about things. I mean, there were some very interesting things that you were talking about, but mostly it's because you are so focused on understanding the model behind the idea. You are modeling things. It's like, when you're talking about empathizing with people, you're understanding and putting yourself in their shoes instead of
Yep.
situationally understanding the emotions. This is just one example. It's like you are having a thorough and concise sort of maybe not thorough and concise. Maybe that's the incorrect way. That sounds very ti. I shouldn't say that. You are having a very you want to distill things down and to having a good understanding of them. You
Mhm.
have this personal understanding and application of the information rather than you trying to fill out the external part of the object to understand what the object is. You yourself are studying the object, and I'm seeing that over and over again throughout the typing session. So you're definitely static.
Right. Can I jump in and say one thing there? Because I was kind of inspired by one particular thing you said with another idea.
Sure.
What you had said about me, well, my type trying to understand the you have to bear with me for a second here. I gotta try and remember exactly what you said. But the basic point you were getting across was how I put myself in other people's shoes to empathize with what they're going through rather than focusing on the emotional, like the current emotional environment. Um, it's kind of like that's actually one of the biggest reasons why I've always personally had a problem with something like extroverted feeling. Um, and it's kind of sparked this idea in my head that I'd never really put into words before. But that the idea of society and human beings functioning as a collective is really only exists as a consequence of it exists as a consequence that we never brought upon ourselves. And kind of if I want to elaborate on the philosophical bit, but not in a long form rant, um, with where I come from, with my personal beliefs as a Christian, that's a fascinating concept to me because of how I view my relationship with creation itself. And really, if you want to I can actually take the religious aspect out of it. You have your own personal reality, and then there is a secondary reality, which is the um, group dynamic that you fit into. Now, I do think and acknowledge that some people are more wired to predominantly pay attention to that external, like, society, that external feeling reality. But at the end of the day, that is something that is inevitably just fake, and it's meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Because if you can properly understand the dynamic that each individual is bringing to the table, then you will be able to far more accurately perceive the external emotional environment. I've never understood the real use of extroverted feeling other than it feels like it created its own necessity. And it feels like as a function, it works that way. Like, we could be perfectly fine without it. Like, if everybody functioned with FI, I feel like we'd be fine. I've never understood the true need for extroverted feeling. I understand its
Yes.
use, but I think philosophically, I feel like it's a weird one.
And I actually can explain that, but I mean, maybe if I'm gonna post this online, I guess I could explain it a little bit because people will be listening in and they'll be interested. But basically, what it is that it's having that contact between people. You know, it's like where the FI is the depth and FI is the modeling. FE is the glue and the orientation that holds things together. It's like the communication. It's the fixation on the humor, on the communication and the tactile impression that it leaves when you touch somebody else. And so that's kind of what it is that FI in comparison is actually rather cold and distant. It might be more accurate in some ways because it's more thorough and it's understanding. But that FE is going to be more along the lines of the binding of people and of the cohesion and of making them into a system or structure and valuing participation, valuing lighthearted emotion, valuing these things where the FI is digging deep and the FI is shy. The FI just blocks away and wants to form its own opinions and its own thing. So it has this cold seriousness to it that the FE doesn't have. So the FE is, humorous and uproar, raucous. It's entertaining.
Actually, that is exactly why I have a problem with it, though. Because I feel like all of those, like making those important, when you actually have to make them important, it's just always felt fake. FE has almost always felt fake to me. And it feels like it's just kind of a function that's been designed to cope with the harsher reality that FI usually brings. Um, and it's just like I always take issue with it because it prevents the truth from coming out in situations. And I think, maybe, I don't know, it's something I have to spend a little more time thinking about, but it's something I have considered before. And even down to when I had my relationship with this one ENTP, it was something we actually talked about a lot. Like, because she would alter her behavior in a way that, like, I knew wasn't authentic to her because it was more harmonious with the external environment around her. But the problem is, like, on, on a fundamental basis, that is inevitably untrue to who she is, and it causes problems down the line. That's the issue I take with FE, is it always actually ends up causing problems down the line when you aren't truthful. And that's why I say I understand how it evolved from, like, an evolutionary standpoint and why it's useful, but useful does not always mean truthful. Things can be
yes.
used to harm,
See,
but
that's where you and I are probably on maybe opposite ends of the spectrum philosophically, because I tend to think that you can make things as accurate as possible, but if those ideas have a negative effect, then it's like what's good of having any of them? And I can go down the list of this like modern intellectualism, postmodernism, and the cynical nature of which people deconstruct things, and it's like maybe there is warrantedness for this cynicism because the world isn't perfect and it's so horrifying that we can't explain it. And so all we have to do is to be open minded about it. Yes, But it's like, how does that philosophy actually affect anything? How does that practically affect people when the ideas it replaces, um, it might be outdated, might be not well understood because modern man is so divorced from its creation, but it is also completely ignorant of the effect that that has on the people. And so to knock it down, because to say that it's not accurate, that it's not realistic, and that this is more realistic, well, what does that ultimately do but leave people completely lost? And that's
That's
kind of,
actually exactly my complaint about FE. I feel like FE is what does that
I think it's
in the
TI.
name of keeping social harmony.
That's TI for me. That's TI for me. What I was just describing. But let's go ahead and get
Yeah,
to
we
the
can get into that later.
yeah. Let's get into the quadras here. So yeah. The question that I usually use to decipher this is the political question, and so basically, you'll see different avenues as the way people kind of answer in depending on the quadra. Even though that there can be political overlap between quadras, I've seen that and experienced that firsthand. Um,
Mm.
I believe that your quadra is delta. And so delta means FITE, SINE, those two axes. Doesn't matter what order, but just those two axes. So
Mm.
basically, you were answering it with these very broad perspective and creative ideas. So it's like, let's try this new thing. It's sort of radical, but it's ultimately focused on altruism and trying to improve the emotional states of the people around. So it's like, you have this creative experimental style like an alpha quadra, but it's like, it's very aristocratic. So aristocratic means unifying with the emotions, not applying. That's what I was writing down when I got distracted earlier. What was it? It was like, well, one's applying and the other's unifying. It's like unifying with the emotions instead of applying of the emotions. And so it's not that it's transcendent logic that you're focused on. It's like actually changing the psychological state of the people by removing them from their environment. I've heard Alpha Quadra people say very similar things to that, which is interesting. But it's also one of those things where it's like, I see a lot of alpha in the way that you responded to that because it's like new and novel ideas that could fix the world. But it was so focused on the psychological state and condition that it was very aristocratic, or very NF, or ST, if you will. So it
Yep.
had it had that effect of focusing on the broad scale of what that emotional interplay is between these large portions and sections of society. And I had that understanding of it. And I do agree. I think, that's one of the positive things about COVID is that it actually brought people away from the humdrum nature of their lives to really reset things. And, maybe it also did horrible things that were very nasty in the lives of those people as well. But, there's just like a small silver lining.
It's kind of funny how it lines up with the idea that we're going into the age of Aquarius, which is supposed to be a much more detached and kind of like aloof way of living.
Yes. Oh, I
And
think
given the era that COVID has now created, I can see how that would kind of manifest as that psychological state in most people.
yes, I would
Oh,
definitely
it's
say that people have to be
interesting to
aloof.
pay attention to those things.
Yeah, because like I have to be aloof in this day and age. I can't be too interconnected. I can't be too hands-on or grounded. It has to be to me intellectualized because the experience of it is too much for me to bear. That's why I turn off the news. Like that's why I don't like to listen to news stories, and I have to focus on like being the best person I can be because it's the only thing I can do. You know?
Yeah, before I could really conceptualize what was going on, I used to listen to the news all the time because I was always concerned about, what I thought was right or wrong. And then when I started to understand more and more and be able to, well, when my empathy grew, let's put it that way, um, it started making me sick. Just watching all the people disagree and fight and bicker. And then I started to try and understand why they did that. And eventually it led me to the beliefs I have now and the way of being that I have now. But it's actually interesting to note how much I've changed in that regard, even over the span of just 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, yeah, to tie it up in a nice little bow. I'm seeing very strong denotations of extroverted intuition. And then I'm also seeing the ethical version of extroverted intuition in your political question. And so that's where aristocratic comes into play, and that's where judicious comes into play. I know it's more of those dichotomies, and that's why, and so that's basically how I placed you on the axes there, to be and delta. Because, yeah, judicious means any SI, and then aristocratic means basically NF. So,
Just
yeah.
one quick note to anyone who ever ends up watching this podcast: if you have an ENFP in your life, appreciate how capable their minds are, because they probably have considered a lot more than you think they have.
Oh my God. There's the mobilizing TE for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll explain that in a bit as well. So this is not the way that the elements are listed in Model A. The elements are associated with the functions in MBTI. I think you could use those terms interchangeably, element or function. We're going to start by their dimensionality, and we're also going to begin with the unvalued ones. The way that the elements are described in socionics is within blockings of communication. I'm not going to be talking too extensively about the blockings, but you can read on that if you want to. I can send you some resources after the typing session. Um, but yeah, we're gonna start with the the id blocking. So the id blocking is going to be elements that are strong but unvalued. These are going to be things that you're going to be capable of doing in high resolution, but you are going to be cynical about their use, and so you're not going to really care that much. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to begin with demonstrative, which is four-dimensional unvalued. Four-dimensional meaning high dimensionality, so it's high in resolution, high in strength. So with the demonstrative function, this is going to be something that is going to be very strong and that the person is going to kind of embody. But being the demonstrative function, it is something they're going to be cynical of. So they're going to be a good ambassador of this without decisively using this, if that makes sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so your demonstrative, I believe, is extroverted feeling, FE, or extroverted ethics, as it's said in socionics. So
Mm-hmm.
with extroverted ethics, you're going to find a person who is going to be capable of producing a positive mood amongst people. They're going to be focused on the different perspectives and emotional interplay. So this is going to be picking up on body language. This is going to be considerate of people when they're displaying emotions. But this is also in the demonstrative position, finding the changing of people's emotional states as somewhat fake and vapid, which is something that I find often with FE super no, not FE super FE id. So so that's one of the answers that I often get. And so you're focused on basically your own understandings of people's emotional states, and then you're recollecting, you're
Mm-hmm.
introspecting, and then you're piecing together in a static way rather than dynamically picking up on the emotions. Even though you're very good at being able to have interplay with those emotions, you tend to interact with them in a static, not a dynamic way.
Right. It's only out of necessity that I use that.
Yes, exactly. The
Yeah.
unvalued functions are usually emergency functions. Maybe not emergency. The role function I probably associate with that a lot, but we'll get into that later. Um, Now we're going to move on to ignoring, three-dimensional unvalued. The ignoring function, unlike the demonstrative function where it's so strong that it's self-evident, the ignoring is like an on and off switch. It's there, it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
It can only be activated for a few minutes before it goes back into obscurity because they don't give too many considerations for this. The ignoring function I believe you have is introverted intuition. And the reason for that is that you're describing being able to predict and understand the outcome of situation. You didn't explicitly say that it's like, I don't like to go down a specific avenue because I feel like that could be incorrect, so I like to have other brands in the fire. That's like a very common way I've heard NI ignoring described. But I believe that you're demonstrating this specifically because you are rejecting of time fields and time states, and instead you're intellectualizing it rather than swimming through the time. And so it's like I'm not too concerned about time because it's completely evident to me. That's what you see with ego and I. But it's that you are dismissive of understanding time entirely. So it's not that you're fluent in it, I mean. It's that you've intellectualized it and then you've compartmentalized it, rather instead of interacting with it very organically. So can you see where things are going to end up? Are you going to take interest in esoteric things and of transcendent ideas and concepts? Yes, because the intuition is strong and evident. But what you're not interested in is necessarily going down specific time-based scales of understanding how the world manifests. You're seeing it as parts, components, and structures, rather than a dynamic field flowing into the future.
The only time that is real enough to do anything about is now. That's how I see it.
Yep, exactly. There's the static. There's the extroverted perceiving right there. So cool, cool, cool. Now we're going to move on to the next blocking, which is super ego. These elements are weak and unvalued. Not strong and unvalued, but weak and unvalued. Um, these are going to be also basically elements of criticism, and basically how people are going to what people will criticize you for, and what you will criticize others externally for. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, sorry, wait a second. We're going to start with role, which is two-dimensional unvalued. So with the role function, this is a load-bearing function. I know I keep switching between elements and functions as you describing, but bear with me.
Okay.
So it's going to be load-bearing, but it is not going to be the thing that this person is going to move towards or use all the time. The blocking that it is with is going to be kind of very weak and not very tangible, so it will often associate with the creative function more than anything else. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to type people. I can't think of the relation right now. I'll have to study. But it's opposing to your base, we'll say. So the role function that I believe that you have is SE, or extroverted sensation. So extroverted sensation is going to be about knowing when to act or when to execute. It is going to be good at basically and wait a second. It's going to be good at tactical understandings of the situation. So it's like the application of the information in a way that is instantaneous and relevant to the situation. So it's going to be, I know when to act. I know when to pull the trigger. I know when to do this. This is going to be something that you're going to see with SE users. But high SE is, like SE base, for example, is probably overaction or doing too much. But so the reason I believe that this is your role function is because you are capable of having conflict with people or being cynical of things when you need to, which is what SE is strongly associated with, but it's also a characteristic of a negative. And so the type that I'm going to give you is negative instead of positive. And I believe that's more of a very general thing to say rather than to say that all people of this type are negative. I think they're more so producing than they are accepting and open. So, it's just a type in general. So it's like basically that cynicism around people and knowing when to have conflict with them is something that you're going to find with the SE role much more than the SE polar. So judicious types who are going to be any ego who demonstrate the capability to have arguments and conflict are much more likely to be SE role. Much, much more likely to be SE role. And that's what I'm kind of seeing is that you know when to act. But you'll also see with people who are SE role that they can be pretty good at being explorative or wanting to find experience, much in the way as an SE user. They tend to conceptualize things rather than to experience it directly. So yes, I believe that you are SE role for sure. Now moving on to the polar, which unlike all the other unvalued functions, it is not a load-bearing function. It is one-dimensional unvalued. It is a point of weakness where this person's just not going to be good at it, and they're not going to want to do it, and they're going to be cynical of it completely, to the point where they can stack information at it at infinite, but will refuse to actually apply the information. So I believe that this one for you is TI. I believe because of your subtype that this one is boosted. that you are more structured than normal. So
Oh.
with polar TI, what you're going to find is somebody who's going to be unstructured. This is going to be somebody who's going to be very spur of the moment and spontaneous. They are not going to compartmentalize or systematize things as relating to understanding it to a fine point. So it's like you have the information and you understand it so concretely that you can describe it to someone else in a sentence or two. That's what you're going to find with people who are going to be strong in TI. So without that TI use, it's going to be much more elaborative. You're going to be much more pondering of information. It's going to take you more time to understand or to communicate or to basically effectively say. But it also means that intellectually, there probably will be a little bit less stubbornness. That you're probably going to be open minded and then therefore not too fettered or tied down in structure. So this lack of structure can have advantages as well, but it also means that coming back to a baseline is going to be something that polar TI is not going to do very well. So you were very positive about this, but of course I had notes written down. Let me get those notes. Okay, so I was saying that you were very positive about talking about TI, but you were focused on the purpose and seeing things as constantly shifting. So it's like instead of understanding things at their most fundamental level, what you were really focusing on is how that thing actually manifests externally, right? And so it's like that's where I'm seeing result. That's where I'm seeing TE. That's where I'm not seeing TI because it's like you're not focusing on you're not focusing on having the best understanding of it because you see it as constantly shifting, and that's because it's so many different avenues, so many different perspectives. And also you're going to find with deltas is that they're not going to want to have rules, these harsh rules that they expect other people to follow, but it's really going to be using your understanding of things to improve yourself and your position in the world. And so this is one of those things where you see things as constantly shifting and where it's not this really hard point of data. Oh, and by the way, while I'm looking at my notes, one of the things about SE is that you're also very, very cynical about pushing people around, is one of the things I've noticed, which is another good example of low dimensionality SE. But,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think now that we've correctly described TI, where TI is never changing, TI is going to be the static understanding forever, and that's why this principle has to be perfect. That's not what you were talking about at all during the typing session. Even though you're categorizing things basically in very TE determinisms, like is this useful or not. You know, I find that you can find an LSI who's TISE, for example, or an ISTP, can also be good at that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the ego blocking. With the ego blocking, these are going to be the elements that you represent to the world, your mask, your face, what other people look to you for, and the purpose that you play. So
This will be interesting.
we're going to start with the base, four-dimensional valued. The base function is inescapable. It is strong. It is always on. You are the ambassador of this in its entirety. You use this continuously in order to apply externally into the world. And so I believe that your base function is extroverted intuition. The reason I believe that you're extroverted intuition is because you're focusing so much on being open-minded and perspective. You see things as constantly shifting or changing and is always ultimately transient. You know, your understanding of history, which I find that many NE users will rip axioms directly out of history to apply later in different circumstances. Maybe that's perhaps more of an alpha way of going about history. But so it's like the thinking element of any the thinking subtype of it. But
I know what I said earlier, but I have to admit I do actually kind of do that.
yes, it's see, and that's part of the TI polar as well. That it's like you might
Hmm.
respond differently to these questions each time that they're asked. That's a very TI polar trait as well.
Right, because the context changes. The context
Yes,
that I
yes,
understood, at least.
yes, exactly. So that's where it's like the things being constantly in a state of flux or dynamic or shifting. You find that a lot with Delta and Fs is that they ultimately see things as so complex that they don't want to make harsh decisions about it because it could be like, it could be this or it could be that. It doesn't have to be what I think it's going to be. It could be what this other person thinks. This other person might have a good idea that I could follow through and do something good with myself. So that there's not a lot of cynicism because there's not that beta quadra ti se. Is this rule right or wrong? Is this rule to be followed or not? It is more so along the lines of there are many different ways to act. There are many different avenues of possibility. And so we must be open to seize that opportunity. So that's more about the TE.
If you had one shot.
Yeah. Yeah, now I have Eminem stuck in my mind already. Because
it's easy to do.
Yeah. So now we are going to move on to the creative, which is basically the alternate hand to the dominant. It is constantly reassessing and reorganizing what is being passed down from the base function and making it more palatable, making it more usable, making it more understandable. And so it's constantly doing work to make the base more nuanced. It's also going to be, strong valued. It's going to be something that you're going to represent and that you're going to be very good at doing. I find you to be the more ambiverted subtype, and so this function for you is boosted. Not that all ambiverts have boosted creative, but I'm saying this specifically because I think that this is a stronger function or element for you. So in comparison to average. So I believe that this one is introverted ethics, or FI. And so the reason that I believe you to be FI is because you are modeling other people. You are putting yourself in their shoes. You are not making hard decisions about things. You are ultimately pondering them as your relationship to them. What is important to you? What is ethical? It is the people I am close to, the people that I have formed bonds with, the people that mean something to me, that form my virtues and ethics and understanding. That's very FI because it's talking about the relation of objects. It's not talking about is this object objective or not. Because I tend to think of logic as being objective and as ethics as being subjective, rather in the Myers-Briggs terms where it's introverted versus extroverted, which is like, what is even subjective logic anyway? That doesn't make sense to me. So, yeah. So as I was saying, I see a lot of FI and a lot of the things that you said. Particularly in the way that you were talking about fluidly understanding your own emotions. You find people who are going to be ego TI, for example, are going to be making rules or principles about how they deal with your emotions. You were talking about very like organically kind of like interacting with them. And it's like this is like the spiritual experience that I am flowing through and that I am understanding and that I am embodying. It's not that you were like, oh, I'm grumpy, I need to eat. Oh, I'm this, I need to sleep, it's this transcendent experience, this aristocratic understanding of ethics. And so there it's like where you're seeing the high dimensionality of your FI. All right. So has all this made sense so far?
Yeah.
Cool. Now we are going to move on to the super id. Super id is the blocking of weak but valued. These are going to be things that you're going to get better at as you get older, and things that you kind of appreciate when you see done well. We're going to start with the mobilizing. Mobilizing is two-dimensional valued. It is the juvenile function. It is the face that you show to the world, but because you're more ambiverted, this is not as much. But it's this thing that you are ultimately wanting to do and to demonstrate for other people so that you can be praised for. This is going to be the thing that and this amateurishness that you are going to use a lot and that other people can be offended at its use. So I think that this is less of the case for you. Some IEEs do have that relationship to their TE, and they will bulldoze and push on people. They don't have the structure of the TI to bring themselves back. So it's like that's one of the things is that IEEs can often be too pushy. Of course, I just told you what your type is, but I believe
I'd already figured it out by now. But
of course you did. Yeah, of course. But yeah, so I believe that yours is extroverted logic, TE. So with TE in the mobilizing position, You're going to find somebody who is going to be better at being task oriented or being focused on the completion of things or looking at how things can be done. So it's like, you're talking about context, for example, how that changes the way that things are illuminated or the way that things look. And so that changes the way that you go about understanding them. It's a very good example of being TE valuing. I definitely think that you having this fixation or focusing on the application or like on the external structuring, especially because you're a result type. Some TE users are not result. Some TE egos are not results. ILI, INTJ, for example, is INTJ in MBTI terms for you snooty people who are probably wanting to criticize me for that. But so they're going to be people who are going to be so thorough, you know what I mean? Unlike the SLI, which is going to be more generalist because they are also a result. But so I'm seeing that very much the fixation on the external when it comes to your logic. What is the application? What is the output? What is the effect? What does it lead up to? That's what you're more focused on than anything else. And so it kind of leads to this generalist or more dynamic way of getting things accomplished or done that you will fill the role of as you get older and as you individuate. So, especially at your young age, this might also be why it's not as apparent. I sincerely think it's just because you're ambiverted. Now we're going to move on to one-dimensional suggestive. This is the seeking function. So this is what you can't do for yourself, but you value. So you look for other people who can make product or value. I see people with a suggestive function behave in a boom-bust mentality. I've been saying that for years. I've been saying it for years, and it's exactly what you said about how you clean your room. How do I deal with my internal state? How do I deal with that harmony? How do I deal with that dynamic field of objects I have to come home to, my room? Well, I ignore it for most of the time, and then I get frustrated with it, so I throw it all back into position. Very suggestive SI. You're going to find that as somebody who's going to be with their states, they're going to be neurotic with it. So this could be somebody who could be like, have FOMO, fear of missing out. This could be somebody who could be hypochondria, because it's somebody who it's like their physical sensations can actually be bothering or agitating them because it's so low in dimensionality. Nevertheless, it is valued. I'm seeing that even though that judicious types tend to be more easily relaxed, that this is something that you're not very good at. So this is indicating that despite you having judicious characteristics, that it's low dimensionality SI. And not only is it low dimensionality SI, you're going to find grounding people be incredibly useful throughout your life. And you will.
I have known that my room not being clean has been aggravating me on a nearly subconscious level, but I still won't do anything about it.
Yep. Yep. And that's because it's static, right? It's because the person can't break out of their current mood or state, and that they have to wait until the impetus changes, or that something has changed in order for them to do it. Unlike the dynamic person, I tend to be more dynamic in nature.
That's exactly how I've described it before. It's like I I can stand there and look at my room and know, like, from a logical standpoint, perfectly well that this is bothering me, but my brain and whatever is in charge of my motivation, when I ask it, like, hey, can we do this? It's just like, no, no.
Yeah. See, I'm a harmonizing subtype, and I also have higher dimensionality SI. So that's not nearly as hard for me. I just cleaned my room a little bit ago as well, and I'm about to clean the house and cook food. But yeah, so now the Model A portion is out of the way. I am typing you IEE, which is any FI. We're gonna go ahead and move on to the DCNH portion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read off a couple paragraphs, and I want you to tell me if you resonate or not.
Okay.
Prototypes, dating services, specialist personnel selector. Normalizing, IEE prefers contact with like-minded people and meticulously selects associates according to their abilities. He gradually creates a small circle of people based on common interest and shared values. He is able to work on consolidating small groups into medium-sized teams, which consist of several smaller ones. He possesses a sense of distance between people and relationships, which is seen as the attraction or repulsion between people. Initially, he is inclined to idealize people and relationships and exaggerate their merits or flaws. However, over time, he begins to realize that this is not necessarily and drifts away from reality and corrects himself. Black and white judgments are replaced with numerous shades of gray. Normalizing IEE may excel in psychotherapy and family counseling, where the main objective is the right attitude towards people, taking into account individual characteristics. How does that sound?
Like you opened up my back and pulled out the instruction manual.
Yep. That's usually what I hear when I get the DCNH correct. I definitely think that you are normalizing, mostly because normalizing has that sort of like cynicism and structure to it, that philosophical understanding of things. So it's having that very structured and thorough understanding and grasping and conception. The normalizing is said to be very slow and thorough. So that's where it's like you are not the type of person to make black and white judgments. You are the type of person to see things as very complex. And that's what you've told me throughout the entire typing session. I think this is why you focus on ideas so much, because they describe so much to you that you find so valuable.
The funny part and what I've been working on lately, though, and one of the realizations I came to only much, much later in my journey, is that things actually are black and white, but it's so unbelievably hard to distill them down to a finite enough question where it becomes a black and white yes or no, that it really is just more effective at the end of the day to describe the truth of the gray that multiple black and white questions create, if that makes sense. Because the answer to some
Yes.
of the small questions would be black, the answer to some of the small questions would be white. But if you put that concept together, the concept itself becomes gray.
Yes. Yes. I mean, and this is like exactly describing why you're the antonym of LSI, why you're the LSI's conflictor, because the LSI is black and white. The LSI is like, is this information correct or not? And it's like, see, what you're talking about is that it's so complex and it's so nuanced, and that's what you've been telling me throughout the entire typing session. So, this is going to be the final typing for the session, IEE normalizing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it off now.